When Karoline Leavitt stepped into a quiet, upscale bistro in New Hampshire, no one paid her much attention. Just another diner, just another table. But across the room, a young blind girl sat frozen, her hands clenched under the table, as a smug waiter mocked her for struggling to read the menu. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't the only one watching. Because in true Karoline Leavitt style, she didn't just call him out. She turned the entire moment into a lesson no one in that restaurant would ever forget. And by the time the night was over, respect had found its rightful place. The restaurant had the kind of warmth that made people linger, dim lighting, soft jazz weaving through the air like a quiet conversation. The clink of glasses and the low hum of murmured voices created a rhythm all their own. The walls were lined with deep mahogany shelves, displaying vintage wine bottles and framed photographs of long-forgotten grand openings. The scent of buttered steak and rosemary filled the air, mixing with freshly baked bread that waiters carried from table to table. At the entrance, the hostess stood behind a polished wooden stand, her posture straight, her smile carefully curated for every new arrival. A couple entered, dressed in evening casual, their laughter soft but full. Behind them, an older man in a gray blazer removed his hat, nodding toward the bar before taking his usual seat. Then the door opened again. Emily stepped in with her mother, a folded cane resting lightly in her hand. She was 17, tall but delicate, with dark waves of hair that framed her face. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her back, guiding her forward. The hostess's smile faltered just for a second, but she recovered quickly. "Welcome to La Petite Maison," she said smoothly, reaching for 2 menus. "Just the 2 of you tonight?" Emily's mother nodded. "Yes, a special night out." The hostess gave a polite smile and picked up 2 menus without hesitation. Both standard, glossy cardstock, full of elegant script Emily wouldn't be able to read. "This way," she said, leading them through the dining room. They were seated near the back, a quiet corner table tucked away from the main bustle. The lighting was softer here, the hum of conversation distant. It was perfect. Emily ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the table, smiling. "Feels fancy." Her mother chuckled, settling into her chair. "You deserve it." Emily exhaled, shoulders relaxing. They didn't go out much. Between school, doctor visits, and her mother's long shifts, moments like this were rare, a treat. The warmth of the bistro wrapped around them, safe and comforting. For now. Because in just a few minutes, that warmth would be replaced by something else, something colder, something that would leave the whole room watching. The waiter appeared beside their table without introduction, young, sharp-jawed, a little too confident. His name tag read, Jake. He pulled a notepad from his apron and placed 2 menus on the table with a quick flick of his wrist. A careless movement, dismissive, like he had done it 1,000 times before, like it didn't matter. Emily instinctively reached forward, fingers brushing against the cover. It was smooth, heavy. She traced along the edges, searching. But the braille wasn't there. Her hands stilled. Her mother noticed first. "Excuse me," she said, voice polite but firm. "Do you have a braille menu?" Jake barely looked up from his notepad. He let out a slow breath, just short of an eye roll. "Nope, just those," he said. "Do you want a minute?" Emily's cheeks warmed, not from embarrassment, from frustration. She wasn't surprised. This happened all the time, restaurants assuming everyone could read the same swirly fonts, never stopping to think that some people experience the world differently. Her mother smiled politely, trying to smooth over the moment. "Could you read a few things aloud for her?" Jake's pen tapped against his notepad. Tap, tap, tap. Impatient. Then he smirked. It was small, but Emily caught it instantly, the way his lips curled slightly at the edges. The amusement in his tone when he said, "Sure thing." But he didn't just read, he performed. In an exaggerated, drawn-out voice, he dragged out the words, "Okay, we have one of our very special appetizers, crispy truffle fries. He paused for effect, looked between them, waiting. Emily's fingers curled against the tablecloth. The couple at the next table stopped their conversation. A man near the bar flicked his gaze toward them. Her mother's voice stayed even. "That's unnecessary." Jake just grinned. "Sorry, just making sure she gets all the details." Another pause, then a chuckle. Not from Jake, from another table. Emily's stomach twisted. Jake tapped his notepad once more, then shrugged. "Look, if you already know what you want, I can just take your order." Like she was the inconvenience, like she was the problem. Emily didn't move, didn't speak, because this moment wasn't about food anymore. It was about something much bigger, and someone else in the restaurant was already paying attention. The weight of the moment settled over the table like a thick, suffocating fog. Emily's mother tried again, her voice measured but firm. "Look, I understand you don't have a Braille menu, but could you at least read a few options normally, just so she has a chance to decide?" Jake exhaled loudly, shifting his weight to one side like this was the most exhausting request he'd heard all night. His fingers drummed against his notepad, a slow, impatient rhythm. Then he muttered under his breath, but just loud enough for them to hear, "Guess I'm a storyteller now." Emily stiffened. A couple at the next table stopped mid-conversation. The man, a businessman in a crisp navy suit, glanced over, his brow furrowed. His date, a woman in a red dress, frowned slightly, shifting in her chair. The energy in the restaurant shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable. Emily felt it, felt the way people were starting to look, to notice. She had been here before, too many times. The moments where strangers saw her, not as a normal 17-year-old, but as a spectacle, something to pity, something to whisper about. And the worst part? She hated that she could feel herself shrinking, because this was supposed to be a normal night, because she just wanted one dinner where she didn't have to fight to be treated like everyone else. Her mother squared her shoulders, still holding on to patience, but only barely. "I don't think it's a lot to ask," she said. "She's just trying to pick her dinner." Jake let out another sigh, flipping open his notepad like he was doing them a favor. Emily pressed her hands into her lap, her heart pounding. She could feel every eye in the room. And just a few tables away, someone else was watching too. Someone who wasn't going to let this go on much longer. Jake smirked. That kind of smirk that wasn't just cocky, it was cruel. He wasn't just being impatient. He was enjoying this. "Fiend," he drawled, voice dripping with mockery. He picked up the menu, held it at arm's length, and then he performed. "Okay, so we have lovely steak." The exaggerated slowness, the stretched out vowels. Emily's stomach twisted. A table across the room stopped eating. A woman gripping a glass of wine froze mid-sip. Then a laugh. Not from Jake, from another table. Emily's fingers curled into fists under the table. Her nails dug into her palms. Her cheeks burned, not just from anger, but from humiliation. Her mother's chair scraped slightly against the floor as she leaned forward. "You need to stop." Jake shrugged like it was all a joke. "I'm just making sure she gets all the details." Another uncomfortable chuckle from a man at the bar, but this time it wasn't funny. The couple from earlier? The woman in red? She wasn't smiling. Across the room, Karoline Leavitt put down her fork. Jake turned back to Emily, still grinning, still amused with himself. "So, what'll it be?" Emily swallowed hard. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of all these people. But she didn't have to say a word. Because before she could even open her mouth, someone else stood up. And suddenly the entire restaurant shifted again. Because now, this wasn't just about Emily. It was about what happened next. The restaurant doors swung open, letting in a brief gust of cool air. The shift was almost imperceptible, just another diner walking in, just another table being filled. But the moment Karoline Leavitt stepped inside, there was a presence about her. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, she didn't need to be. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. A quiet authority, poised, self-assured. She walked with the precision of someone who had spent years in the public eye, but never let it harden her. The hostess greeted her with a polite, "Welcome to La Petite Maison," and led her toward a table near the center of the restaurant. As she walked, she took in her surroundings. The low-lit chandeliers, the crisp white linens, the murmur of quiet conversations. A normal evening, or so it seemed, because something felt off. She noticed it before she even sat down. The small shifts in energy, the uneasy glances, the way conversations felt slightly stilted. Her gaze flickered toward the far end of the dining room. That's when she saw it. A young girl sitting still in her chair, her hands curled into fists in her lap. Across from her, her mother sat stiffly, trying to maintain composure, and hovering beside them, a waiter with a smirk that didn't belong in a place like this. Karoline's eyes narrowed. She didn't need to hear the full conversation to understand exactly what was happening. The mocking tone, the exaggerated words, the way other diners looked on but said nothing. She picked up her menu but barely glanced at it. Instead, she watched, studied, waiting. Because whatever was happening at that table, it wasn't over yet. And soon, neither was she. Jake snorted as he turned toward another waiter, shaking his head as if to say, "Can you believe this?" With an amused smirk, he leaned over and muttered something under his breath. The other waiter, a younger guy, clearly nervous, clearly unsure, gave an awkward chuckle, not knowing whether to laugh along or stay quiet. Emily heard it. She wasn't naive, she wasn't fragile, but she was done. Her mother placed a calming hand on her arm. "Emily, sweetheart." But Emily didn't need comfort. She didn't need reassurance. She needed to speak. Her chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back from the table, lifting her chin with quiet resolve. The heat in her cheeks wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was something stronger. She took a breath. Then her voice rang through the room, clear, sharp, and unshaken. "I may be blind, but at least I can see who the real joke is here." The air shifted. The clatter of silverware stopped. A fork, half lifted to someone's mouth, froze midair. At the bar, a man lowered his drink. Even the couple who had chuckled earlier now looked deeply uncomfortable. The waiter, cocky, grinning, untouchable just moments ago, blinked, his smirk faltering. Because now the entire room was watching him. And just a few tables away, Karoline Leavitt placed her napkin on the table and stood. Because this wasn't over. This was just getting started. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the bistro was thick with something unspoken, heavy, electric. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room but shifts the entire atmosphere. Jake froze, his smirk flickering with something dangerously close to uncertainty. He had expected Emily to shrink away, to mumble an awkward response, to let the moment pass like so many others probably had before. But instead, she called him out. And now the room was watching. Karoline Leavitt had been watching too. She had seen enough. Without a word, she reached for her napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. Then, in one smooth motion, she stood, heads turned. She didn't storm across the room. She didn't demand attention. She didn't need to. She walked with quiet authority, measured and steady, the kind of presence that commanded respect before a single word was spoken. People shifted in their seats. The couple near Emily's table exchanged glances. Even the bartender, halfway through pouring a drink, paused to watch. Jake stiffened as she approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with forced casualness, but Karoline caught the crack in it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stopped beside Emily's table, glancing between the teenager and her mother before settling her gaze on him. The tension was a wire, stretched tight. Then Karoline spoke. "You think this is funny?" Jake blinked. She didn't let him finish, because what she did next, no one saw it coming. Karoline didn't yell. She didn't rage. She didn't lean in, wag a finger, or launch into some dramatic speech. Instead, she picked up a menu, slow, deliberate, and then she handed it to Jake. "Read this," she said, her voice calm, controlled. Jake faltered. "What?" Karoline's expression didn't change. "Read the menu, out loud, slowly." The restaurant held its breath. Jake let out a nervous chuckle, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Karoline didn't blink. "Go on." The confidence on his face withered under her steady gaze. He looked down at the menu in his hands, suddenly unsure. He licked his lips, tried to gather himself. Then, hesitantly, he began. Tonight's specials include..." His voice was flat, unsteady. Someone in the back snickered. Jake clenched his jaw. The words were right in front of him, clear, readable. He had no excuse. And yet, it was hard, harder than he expected, harder, because now he knew exactly what it felt like. Karoline tilted her head, watching him struggle. And for the first time that night, Jake understood. Because it wasn't just about reading words, it was about the weight of eyes on you. It was about feeling small, about being put on display. Jake swallowed. The room was dead silent. Emily sat still, listening, waiting. Her mother watched, her expression unreadable, and then Karoline spoke again, soft, steady, sharp as glass. "Uncomfortable, isn't it?" Jake's grip on the menu tightened, because now he understood exactly what he had done, and there was no taking it back. Jake cleared his throat, gripping the menu tighter. The words were right in front of him, bold, easy to read, nothing like what Emily had to deal with, but suddenly they felt impossible to say. He started. Tonight's special." His voice faltered. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He tried again. "Tonight's special includes..." A pause, too long. The silence in the room pressed down on him. For the first time that night, Jake felt what it was like to be on the other side of the table, eyes on him, waiting, judging. He stumbled again, his tongue suddenly clumsy, his confidence evaporating. Karoline stood calmly, arms crossed, watching. Emily didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her mother, sitting across from her, stayed silent too, not out of fear, but out of something else, something heavier. Then Karoline spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't need volume to make an impact. She just tilted her head slightly and said, "It's hard, isn't it, struggling to read something out loud while people watch?" Jake froze. A ripple went through the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Because now Jake knew. His cocky smirk was gone. His easy arrogance had melted into something tighter, more rigid, more uncomfortable. The weight of his own actions hit him. And for the first time all night, Jake had nothing to say. Jake looked away, his usual swagger, his cocky smirk, his condescending tone, gone. He shifted awkwardly, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the moment. But there was no shaking it off. He had been exposed, and the whole room saw it. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't push. She just turned to Emily, her expression warm, her voice soft. "May I?" Emily hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because for once she was being asked. Not talked over, not dismissed, not ignored. She nodded. Karoline picked up the menu and began to read. Not slowly, not exaggerated, not as if she were performing for anyone. She just read, clearly, patiently, respectfully. Emily listened, her posture relaxing. A beat passed. Then from the back of the room, a single pair of hands clapped. Then another, and another. The applause was soft at first, a ripple, a shift in the air. Then it grew, not thunderous, not overdone, just enough to let Emily know that she wasn't alone. Jake heard it too. And as Karoline set the menu back on the table, the reality of the moment settled in, Because this wasn't just about a meal, it was about respect. And tonight, respect had just won. Before the applause had fully died down, the restaurant manager rushed over. A man in his mid-50s, dressed in a crisp button-down and a navy tie, his face flushed with urgency. He had been in the back, dealing with orders, but when whispers reached him about a waiter humiliating a blind girl, he moved fast. "Ma'am," he said breathlessly, looking between Emily's mother and Karoline. He exhaled, pressing his palms together. "I sincerely apologize for what just happened." Emily's mother kept her composure. She had spent years advocating for her daughter, learning when to fight and when to let people bury themselves in their own mistakes. She simply raised an eyebrow. "Do you allow your staff to treat people like this?" The manager visibly winced. "Absolutely not," he said quickly. His head snapped toward Jake, who was still stiff, frozen in place. "Jake, step aside." Jake didn't move. His jaw clenched, his hands still gripping his notepad like a lifeline. The manager's voice hardened. "I said, step aside." Slowly, reluctantly, Jake took a step back. The shift was undeniable. The power, the control, the smug amusement he had held over Emily just minutes ago, gone. The manager turned back to Emily and her mother. "I take full responsibility," he said. "This is not who we are, and I will personally make sure this never happens again." He swallowed, nodding once toward Karoline. "Thank you for stepping in." She gave him a polite but measured look. She wasn't here for gratitude, she was here for accountability. And she wasn't finished yet. The restaurant had settled back into an uneasy quiet. The damage had been done, the lesson already written into the walls of the dining room. But Karoline had one last thing to say. She turned back to Jake, who refused to meet her eyes. She studied him for a moment, then spoke. "Compassion costs nothing." A pause, then her voice sharpened. "Not cruel, not angry, just absolute. But today, it just cost you." Jake flinched. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. And everyone felt the ripple. The manager's jaw tightened. "Go to the back, Jake. We'll talk after your shift." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to lash out, fight back, reclaim some of the arrogance he had strutted in with. But he didn't. He just nodded stiffly and turned away. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply turned back to Emily and smiled. Not with pity, not with sympathy, but with respect. "Did you decide on something?" she asked gently. Emily's lips twitched, the smallest hint of a smile creeping in. "The steak," she said. "It actually does sound good." Karoline grinned. "Good choice." The energy in the room had changed, not just for Emily, not just for her mother, but for everyone who had watched and learned. And Jake? He had just learned the hardest lesson of all. The tension in the restaurant had lifted, but something new had taken its place, something lighter. Emily's mother let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment finally hitting her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her napkin, dabbing at the corners of her eyes before she looked at Karoline. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was thick, raw with emotion. Karoline simply shrugged, calm, composed, unwavering. "She handled it just fine on her own," she said with a small smile. Emily turned toward her, surprised. And then she smiled too. Because for the first time tonight, she wasn't being seen for her blindness. She was being seen for her strength, not as a victim, not as someone in need of saving, but as someone who had stood her ground. The same couple who had watched everything unfold earlier. The woman in red, the businessman in the navy suit, smiled in her direction. The bartender gave a small, approving nod. Even the hostess, still at the front, looked as though she had just witnessed something she wouldn't forget for a long time. Emily felt it, the quiet, unspoken shift. Like something had changed, like this moment mattered, and she had been at the center of it. An hour later, the restaurant had returned to normal, or at least it seemed that way. But while Emily and her mother enjoyed their meal, While Karoline resumed her own dinner, while Jake sat in the back, replaying every second in his head, something else was happening. Because someone had recorded it. It started with a single post. A diner near the back had captured the entire confrontation. Karoline standing tall, Jake fumbling with the menu, Emily's sharp, perfect response, "I may be blind, but at least I can see who the real joke is here." The video hit Twitter first, then Instagram, then Facebook, and then it exploded. Retweets stacked by the second, comments flooded in. By the time the clock struck midnight, it had been shared over 2 million times. Then came the headlines. Karoline Leavitt stands up for blind girl after waiter's mockery. Watch. Politician's unexpected reaction to waiter's cruelty goes viral. Respect is free, and this viral video proves it. The internet had its story. The world was watching. And for once, it was watching something that actually mattered. Days had passed, but the moment hadn't faded. Emily had felt it everywhere, in school, in the grocery store, in the quiet spaces where strangers suddenly recognized her. People whispered, some with admiration, some simply curious. She had gone viral, but it wasn't about her. It was about the conversation. The internet hadn't just watched, it had responded. Thousands of comments flooded her inbox, messages from people who had been in her shoes, who had faced the same condescension, the same dismissals, the same quiet battles fought in public spaces. And for the first time, Emily realized she hadn't just stood up for herself, she had stood up for them too. Then, late one evening, her phone buzzed. A new message. She opened it, blinking as she read the name at the top, Karoline Leavitt. Emily hesitated for only a second before tapping the notification. The message was simple, short, but powerful. The world is watching. But more importantly, so are the ones who need a voice. Keep speaking up. Emily stared at the words, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could still feel the weight of that night, the hush of the restaurant, the applause that followed, the way, for the first time, she hadn't been invisible. A small smile tugged at her lips. She didn't need to say anything back. She just held the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. Because she knew. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a lesson, and it wouldn't be forgotten. The screen faded to black. Then the final words appeared. Respect is not a privilege, it's a right. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more shocking.